Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Paul Peppis. I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center, and I want to welcome you to this, the final lecture in the OHC's Portland Public Lectures in this year's theme of connection. As always, I have to give some announcements, before I introduce the speaker. You've seen our information table out there. If you want to sign up for our email newsletters, learn about our programs, upcoming events, all that information is there. Our speakers generously agreed to do Q&A at the end of the lecture. Because we're live streaming the lecture, if you'd like to ask a question, you see that microphone right there, right in the front of the aisle. Come to that mic so that the people that are watching at home can hear you. I also want to let you know that there'll be a book signing after the lecture as well. And the last one of those kinds of details is we have a new, I want to urge you to take the OHC's online survey about this lecture, about our lectures in general, about our programs. There's a link off of our website, which is ohc.uoregon.edu. Last but not least, I need to thank the usual suspects. Many thanks to the fine UO Portland staff here at the White Stag, who always do a great job helping to make our Portland lectures successful. And I also need, as always, to thank the amazing staff of the Oregon Humanities Center, our Associate Director, Julie Hayden, our Program Coordinator, Melissa Gustafson, our Communications Coordinator, Peg Gearhart, and our Student Assistant, Megan Connor. Without the help of our great staff and our collaborators, the OHC could never host events like this and bring major public intellectuals like our speaker tonight, writer and cultural critic, William Deresiewicz. William Deresiewicz will present this year's Kritikos Lecture in the Humanities. Established in 1993 through a generous gift from two of the OHC's loyal Portland patrons, the Kritikos Professorship brings to the university and the state of Oregon distinguished scholars, critics, and leaders in the humanities. From the Greek, kritikos translates roughly as able to judge, evaluate, and criticize. As the term suggests, the Kritikos Professorship was created to foster the education of UO students, faculty, and citizens of the state, and to promote intelligent, critical public discourse across Oregon. Kritikos professors are known for speaking their minds, even if what they have to say is provocative or unfashionable. Given both the professorship's critical aims and our theme of connection, William Deresiewicz was our immediate choice for this year's Kritikos Professor. In the summer of 2008, Deresiewicz published a bracing and controversial essay in the American Scholar titled "The Disadvantages of an Elite Education" that immediately went viral. It's now received over 1 million views. In 2009, he delivered an equally provocative speech at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, later published in the American Scholar as well, entitled "Solitude and Leadership," that also immediately went viral. Clearly, his challenging and timely arguments had struck a powerful chord, or perhaps I should say touched a raw nerve with the American public. William Deresiewicz is a contributing writer for The Nation, a contributing editor for The New Republic, and the author of 2 books, A Jane Austen Education, How 6 Novels Taught Me About Love, Friendship, and the Things That Really Matter, and most recently, Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life, the latter of which has generated hundreds of commentaries, irate and admiring, and provoked a searching, sometimes searing conversation about the state of American higher education, leadership, and society. His lecture tonight, Education in a Neoliberal Age, promises to be no less provocative, determined, and critical. Please join me in welcoming William Deresiewicz.
Hi. Don't applaud so much until you hear what I have to say. Thanks again to the people who've made this possible last night in Eugene, tonight here. Last night, different audience, more of a campus audience. And in view of the fact that the event last night, like tonight, was being live streamed, I suggested that maybe the people watching at home could turn this into a drinking game in their dorms. Every time, do a shot every time I say liberal arts. I don't think that would actually work so well tonight, not just because it's a different audience, but because I'm not going to be talking about the liberal arts per se, although I will touch on them. Last night was an argument about the value of the liberal arts, the value of the humanities. It was drawn more from the book from last year. Tonight I'm going to assume to a certain extent, and if this is a mistaken assumption, perhaps we can rectify this a little bit in the Q&A, but I'm going to assume that you're reasonably familiar with the arguments I made in the book that were excerpted in a piece that came out in the New Republic last summer, a piece that also went viral, 200,000 Facebook shares. My wife recently sent me a video of a black and white dog playing with its chew toy, also 200,000 Facebook shares, which definitely keeps things in perspective. But I presented, I actually spoke like 4 times in the Portland area last summer and early fall, presenting the arguments from the book. And I kind of want to move on and talk about things that have come out of the conversations and experiences, relevant experiences that I've had since then. You may know that I live in Portland. I'm a transplant as of 2008. But this semester, I'm actually not here, despite the fact that I look like I'm here. I have been teaching just for 1 semester at Scripps College, one of the 5 Claremont colleges. It's the women's college, liberal arts college. So partly the experience of teaching at Scripps, which is the first time I've been in the classroom in 7 years since I left Yale, left academia, not voluntarily. You can ask me about that if you want to. First time, so sort of 7 years down whatever curve higher education is moving. And then also the response, the other big sort of set of data points that I'm going to be drawing on is the response to the book and initially to that excerpt that came out a month before the book came out. Responses in public arenas, sometimes they were even from people who had actually read what I wrote. Sometimes they just assumed they knew what I was talking about. And probably even more importantly, responses that I've gotten directly from people who've read either or both of those things and come from a much wider spectrum of people, as I'll talk about in due course. So I want to start by talking about something I saw at Scripps, literally 2 things, 2 objects that I saw at Scripps. And they hit me as soon as I stepped onto campus in January. And you see them in front of you. There are 2 banners that hang prominently throughout the campus. This pair is outside of the dining hall, but they're paired in a number of other places as well. The first one, okay, yeah. What they have in common, aside from the fact that they're visually similar, is that the one on the left is from the founder of Scripps, Ellen Browning Scripps. I think the college was founded in 1926, so it's reasonable to assume that the statement was made around that time. Speaking about the college then, and the second banner, I think, is representative of how the college understands itself now. So the first one, which reads, "The paramount obligation of a college is to develop in its students the ability to think clearly and independently, and the ability to live confidently, courageously, and hopefully." I think the first thing to notice about that text is that it's a sentence. Especially to notice in distinction to the other text. Which means that it's something that expresses an idea by placing concepts in relationship to one another within a structure that we refer to as a syntax, which is already a skill that is not to be taken for granted among college students and college graduates today. This sentence in particular has a highly wrought self-conscious syntax, parallel structure, underscored by the repetition of the words "the ability," a structure that revolves around the arrangement of 5 adverbs, right? First 2 together, and then two balanced against each other, three balanced against one another, the pair balanced against the trio. So a highly wrought spatial arrangement. And also, I don't know for sure that this was Ellen Browning Scripps' intention, but you can read the sentence as also placing its elements in a relationship of time, as describing a narrative in which thinking clearly leads to thinking independently, and thinking independently leads to living confidently, and living confidently leads to living courageously, and finally, living courageously leads to living hopefully. I don't really think I should take the time to unpack each of those relationships, but if you think about it, I think they all make sense. In order to think independently, you first have to think clearly. And in order to live confidently, you need to think independently. These are not just interesting and important relationships. I think many of them are conspicuously absent in the lives of college students today. I find that they are often living neither courageously, and perhaps as a result, nor are they living hopefully. But we can talk about that in due course. The other thing to say about this hypothesized chronological relationship is that the whole sequence begins with a college that recognizes that it has an obligation to its students, and that that obligation entails developing their abilities to do two things: to think and to live. And the final thing I want to say about this sentence is that it is a sentence that identifies itself as having been written by a particular human being, as an expression of her own convictions and ideals, an explanation of what motivated her actions, and in particular, the action of founding a college. In a phrase of Wendell Berry's, this is a woman who is standing by her words. So that's the first sign. Second sign, what does it say? Leadership, service, integrity, and creativity. I think the only interesting thing about the sign is the typography, which seems to be straining rather hard. They are four words that are unconnected by syntax, either to each other or to anything else, which means that they are four words whose meaning and function are left largely undefined. They are either assumed by the speaker or are unknown to the speaker. But of course, even to speak of a speaker is something that the sign does not allow us to do, because it tells us that it's from the college's mission statement. I asked people about this. I actually asked the president of the college and the dean of faculty about this. And they said, what, you haven't seen our mission statement? I'm like, no, where do I find it? Well, it's on our website. I said, okay, but surely these four words were not in the original mission statement, right? And they said, no, it's rewritten periodically. So I said, well, when was the last time it was rewritten and who did it? And they couldn't tell me. And I said, well, okay, who decided to hang a sign with those four words all over campus? And they couldn't tell me that either. So these are four words floating in the ether that come from some bureaucracy. Nobody knows who wrote them. Nobody knows who's responsible for putting them there. And it's surely not a coincidence that three of the four words are probably the three most common buzzwords in higher education today. What's the one that's not? Yeah, integrity. Integrity, not creativity. Creativity has become a buzzword, as we will talk about. Integrity is an interesting wild card. I'm not actually sure what they thought they were getting at. I suspect it has something to do with what other colleges call character. And what they usually mean by character is like not cheating and not raping people. In other words, not doing bad things. The idea that character might involve other things is not really, it doesn't seem to occur to anybody. Still less does it occur to them that they are constantly shaping their students' character, mainly for the worse. Leadership, service, creativity. I will talk about each of those in particular later. But I would say that collectively these four words, and especially those three words, reflect the state of higher education today. This is not about Scripps in particular. For obvious reasons, I'm using Scripps as an example. But I think it's completely typical of what's going on campuses around the country today. And here's what's going on, right? Oh, I'm sorry. The one most important thing I think to say about those four words is that none of them are about thinking or learning. Okay, so that's what's going on in higher education today, in my view. It's not about thinking and learning. And of course, everything I'm saying should come with the understanding that it's not universally true, it's not true for every school, for every professor, for every place at every time. I do believe it is broadly true. So it's not about thinking and learning, and everyone is running around trying to figure out what it is about. Because everyone, meaning people who have jobs at universities and colleges who want to keep their jobs by perpetuating the existence of their institutions, and therefore trying to find a rationale for those institutions once thinking and learning are no longer acceptable as rationales. And so what they've come up so far with is buzzwords, mainly these three: leadership, service, creativity. So I'm gonna remove this now so you're not distracted from my immortal words. Why is this happening now? And I think the short answer is contained in the title of the talk, okay? Because education has been reshaped by neoliberal ideas of value. What do we mean by neoliberalism? We can call it Reaganism or Thatcherism, economism or market fundamentalism. Basically, it's the idea that the market is the exclusive measure of value. What something costs is what it's worth, right? And not just in monetary terms. Or rather, monetary terms are the only terms acceptable for the measurement of value, whether of things or of people. Neoliberalism tells you that you are valuable as a human being in terms of your activity in the marketplace, as a producer or consumer. This is what Wordsworth famously called getting and spending, right? So how is this playing out in the realm of education? Well, let me now talk a little bit about some of the reactions to the book and the excerpt that came out before the book. In very simplistic shorthand, I said that schools, including our elite colleges, are not giving students what you might call a real education. They're not building a self. They're not helping students to build a self, to build a soul, in this sort of self-consciously archaic language that I was using. And one of the most depressing and distressing things about the reaction, especially from people who came from elite institutions, from the Ivy League, and in some cases were still within the Ivy League, was not, of course we provide a real education, although some people said that. Much more common was, what is this real education thing? What is this soul thing? What are you talking about building a soul? That sounds like a fool's errand. That sounds like the kind of thing that only a terribly impractical person would do, that the kind of thing they used to do in the 60s. Ha, ha, ha. Whoever wants to do that? Steven Pinker, the Harvard pseudoscientist, wrote a response to the excerpt where he said, among other things, he said, I may be emblematic of everything that's wrong with higher education today, but I don't know how to help my students build a self. And when we hire people for the psychology department at Harvard, we don't ask ourselves whether the person in question is going to be able to help students build a self. And I thought, he's right. He is emblematic of everything that's wrong in higher education today, precisely because this purpose has been completely lost, to the extent where it's an object of scorn and incomprehension. David Brooks wrote a column that responded to both of us, to Pinker's response to me, and indirectly to me. And I think he put the matter very well, probably better than I had put it in the book. He said, traditionally, there have been understood to be three main objectives in higher education. And the first one is the vocational, getting a job, getting set up for a career. The second one is the cognitive, which is really what Pinker was talking about, what Pinker said he knows how to do, which is to teach students stuff. Although I think it would be better to talk in terms of teaching students skills or even helping develop their own innate abilities rather than teaching them stuff. And the third one, Brooks called the moral purpose, which I'm willing to accept. It's not a word that I use as long as we understand it in the right way. It doesn't mean preaching a certain moral code. It doesn't mean even talking about right and wrong. It understands the word moral in a much broader sense, which means having to do with the making of choices of any kind. And the choices we're really talking about are not ones that are good and bad in any objective way. They are the kinds of life choices that people make for themselves. What am I going to do with my life? What do I think is important? What kind of person am I going to marry? That are much broader than right and wrong and are not susceptible to the application of any kind of predetermined code, whether handed to a student or developed by a student. In other words, we're talking about, when we talk about the moral purpose of an education, we're talking about the development of autonomous adults. Now, so, vocational, cognitive, moral. Of the three rather, only the first, I think, only the first, the vocational, is any longer recognized as an acceptable value in higher education or education in general. The third is out completely, as we've already seen. But it's important to recognize that even the second, the cognitive purpose, which is supposedly the central purpose of a research institution, is tolerated only insofar as it contributes to the first, to the vocational one. And here's a very important statistic. Everybody knows, or many people know, if they're interested in higher education, that the percentage of humanities majors has plummeted since the 1960s. What's much less well known is that the percentage of majors in the physical sciences has dropped by an even greater number. Physics, chemistry, geology, astronomy. This is, of all the sort of new thoughts that I've been having about higher ed, I think to me this is the most important and the one that I most insist on when I talk to people involved in the field. We need to get away from the idea that this is about the humanities, that the decline in the things that we care about is about the humanities per se. It is not. It is about all of the liberal arts, or as they sometimes call it now, the liberal arts and sciences, to remind people that the liberal arts actually include the sciences and social sciences as well. So, people may not be studying philosophy anymore, but they're also not studying pure math. They're not studying physics. When you tell people that you're a political science major, they make the same kind of fun of you as they do if you say that you're a history major. Why are you studying political science? What is that about? Why are you studying anthropology? What are people studying? They're studying, somebody say business? Business is now by far the largest majors, over 20% of students. But you know, at fancy colleges, they don't have business majors, so what do they study? They study econ, computer science, engineering, biological science, mainly as a way of being pre-med. This is not about the humanities versus the sciences, okay? This is not about the humanities versus the sciences. This is about those fields in which knowledge is pursued for its own sake, and therefore those fields that give the greatest rein to curiosity and creativity and exploration and living the life of the mind and being an intellectual, versus fields that are understood to be practical, fields that are understood to give you skills that are immediately negotiable in the marketplace, fields that are vocational. It's not the humanities that are under attack, it's learning for its own sake, it's curiosity for its own sake, it's ideas for their own sake. Now, it is true that those fields form the basis for the vocational fields, right? I mean, biology is the basis for medicine, and physics is the basis for engineering, and the social sciences are the basis for the policy fields. So it seems awfully short-sighted, but of course, the market is always short-sighted. This is one of the great problems with entrusting everything to the market, that it doesn't even know its own interests, let alone other interests. That's the second purpose, the cognitive purpose, but I'm really interested in speaking about the third purpose, educating what used to be called the whole man or the whole person, not just the specialist or the professional, not just the worker. Now, when you talk about that, when I talked about it, you tend to get one of two criticisms, one that I already touched upon. One says, hey man, that was just the 60s, okay? So put down your joint and get serious, because nobody's stupid enough to care about those things anymore. And the other argument says, that's really elitist. You know, that's That was fine for the 19th century WASP aristocrats who went to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. But when working class kids go to college, when middle class kids go to college, they're not interested in that crap because they don't have the luxury of being interested in it. Now, one obvious problem with those two arguments is that they contradict each other. Either it's the 19th century or it's the 60s. It can't be both. Actually, it is both, because what neither of those camps understand, and this is the case with many people who comment on higher education now, is what they don't understand is the actual history of higher education in this country. And if they did understand it, they would understand that this idea was true, it was important in the 19th century, was important in the 60s, and was important in between and before. From the beginning, you can read, I think one great source is my friend and mentor Andrew Del Banco's book, which is just called College. It's called College, What It Was, What It Is, and What it Could Be or Will Be. I don't remember. But he's a great historian of American culture, and he takes you back to the beginning of the colonial colleges in the 17th and 18th centuries when they were church-affiliated institutions, and their primary mandate was not the transmission of knowledge, which in a sense didn't even exist yet, right? This was long before the modern research university as a factory of knowledge. Their main mission was the inculcation of what they called character, and what we might call the education of the whole person. That mission was secularized when colleges became secularized, when they broke their church ties and kind of moved towards that knowledge, towards that model of disinterested knowledge, but they didn't discard the mission to create the whole person. This is why we have great books courses. This is why we have general education courses. This is why we have electives. We're the only country in the world, where when you go to college, you don't just study one thing, right? You have a major, and then you're not only encouraged, but usually required to take a range of subjects and get a broad education. It's also, interestingly, why we have English departments. Because the old classical curriculum was for kids who would learn Latin and Greek in the prep schools. And when those kids stopped being the main constituencies of the fancy Eastern colleges, the colleges needed a new curriculum for their new students, for the kids who had gone to like public high school in New York City. So they started to use first British and then British and American literature as a new humanities curriculum, not for the sake of creating specialists, but for the sake of creating the kinds of generalists I'm talking about. Structures, these are all educational structures that provide students the opportunity, the questions, to ask the questions that are proper to us, not as this or that kind of specialist, this or that kind of professional, but as individuals as such. The very questions that we're apt to ask when we look up from our work and think about our lives. Questions of love, death, family, morality, time, truth, God, and everything else within the wide, starred universe of human experience. We were the first country to have compulsory primary school. We were the first country to have universal high school. We were the first country to make a commitment to mass higher education. We started during the Civil War with the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, right? We were fighting a civil war, but we decided that it was important enough not just to build a transcontinental railroad, but to build a system of public universities, to educate our citizens, and not just to educate them vocationally for the job market. This idea of a general education, of educating the whole person, was part of that mission from the beginning. The 60s weren't an exception. The 60s were the end of the line. But it's quite to the point that the great age, the heyday of mass public higher education after World War II, with the GI Bill, with the reorganization of the University of California, this massive, free, great system of public higher education, with the middle class and the working class moving in huge numbers into college, this was also the heyday of the liberal arts. This was the heyday of the English major. Sometimes when I'm talking on elite college campuses or to journalists from elite colleges, like I just had a an interview with a kid at Columbia, and he asked me a question that I often get asked in those contexts, which is, do most kids who go to college really want to think about the big questions? Don't they want to just get a job? Aren't they just going to college to get a better job? First of all, I think that question is characteristically neoliberal because it's so fucking classist, right? It's like, oh no, the great unwashed, they don't want to, they're not smart enough. They don't. So, then I say, you guys don't want to ask the big questions. I mean, who are you to cast aspersions on the kids down the road at, I don't know, SUNY Purchase, who supposedly are only interested in a vocational education? You're only interested in a vocational education. That's why economics is the biggest major at Columbia and at most of the other top 40 schools. But I think the real answer is yes, they are interested. Every kid is interested if given half a chance. And the real question is whether they're going to be given, whether they are given half a chance wherever they go to college. Let me pull back a little bit and give what I think is the relevant bigger picture here. One version of that 19th century argument, a slightly different version, was in a piece for the New Yorker website by Joshua Rothman. Actually, the New Yorker wrote two pieces in response to my work, both equally condescending and incomprehending. But I know you haven't really arrived until you've been condescended to by the New Yorker, so it's okay. But what Rothman said was that what I'm really talking about is modernity. What I'm really complaining about is modernity and the accelerations of modernity as traceable as he traced them across the literature of modernity. You know, the world is spinning faster and faster and faster, has been since the late 18th century, let's say. And kids are just, you know, they are simply accelerating in primary, secondary, and college in advance of entering that adult world. Now, he's deeply wrong about this, but he's wrong in a way. By posing the issue that way, he helped me understand, I think, something very important, something fundamental, because I had to think about why. I knew he was wrong, but I had to think about why. And I knew he was wrong because I knew that whatever adulthood looks like in modernity, in the literature of modernity, adolescence, youth does not look like that, right? If we think back to our images of youth, whether it's in Portrait of the Artist or whenever, that's not what's going on. Something else is going on. So what's going on? Well, youth looked a certain way in modernity, and I say looked rather than looks for reasons that will be clear in a minute. There was a specific set of ideas, practices that we can call modern youth. We can even say that modernity invented youth. I mean, people have said that. Modernity invented the idea of a time between childhood and adulthood. And the idea that it invented was of a time, not when you start to emulate the adults by accelerating in advance of your entry into the job market, but precisely the opposite, right? And you just think back on this. You all know this. Being young meant not being an adult. It meant standing outside of the world of adults, questioning it, having contempt for it, rejecting it, rebelling against it, and in the extreme case, making revolution against it. Again, the 60s are not the exception, they're the end of the process. And that association in the 60s between youth and social change was not something invented by the 60s. The 60s were playing out a script that had been in place for a couple of hundred years, and probably the best starting point to point at was the French Revolution. That which crystallized that kind of romantic association between youth and rebellion. As Wordsworth said, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. He's writing about the French Revolution in the Prelude. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven, right? This was the time of youth. And it's there, it's in Romantic poetry, it's in the Bildungsroman, you know, the sort of the prototypical, the archetypal novel of the 18th and 19th century, the novel of development or education, where you have a young hero or heroine, whether it's a Jane Austen heroine, or Tom Jones in Fielding, or Wilhelm Meister in Goethe. It's in Stendhal, it's in Flaubert. You question, you reject, and then you find a place in the world. You accommodate yourself to the world, or you accommodate the world to yourself. You accommodate the world to yourself, to your generation, because it was understood by the young, and often grudgingly by the old, or nostalgically by the old, that the job of youth, if not personally then collectively, was to change the world, was to make a different world, was to imagine and make a different world in critique of the existing world. And when we moved from a society where college was a rare privilege to a society where it became increasingly the norm, that idea was absorbed into college. And college became the place where many kids, and maybe the most intelligent, the most energetic, the most idealistic, did that work of questioning the world and imagining a new one, and imagining their place in a different world. It's no accident that college happens when you're a young adult, or that we expect young adults to go to college. They make sense together. This is now explicitly being rejected. And when people say, who wants to get a real education? What is this real education thing about anyway? They are rejecting this. When they say that college in particular and education in general is about preparing you for the job market, they're articulating a different idea of what it means to be young. I talked about what being young looked like in modernity because we're not in modernity anymore. We're in postmodernity, for lack of a better word. And all I mean by postmodernity, I don't mean anything abstruse. I simply mean that age during which neoliberalism is ascendant as an ideology. So, if your only value is as a producer and consumer, then your job as a young person is not to criticize or imagine a new world. It's to start acquiring the skills that are going to make you a good producer and therefore a good consumer. We don't have modern youth anymore. We have postmodern youth. And Joshua Rothman described it very well. Your job as a young person is to start accelerating faster and faster so that when you make that leap onto the speeding bus of adult life, you will be going fast enough. And as you probably know, we don't even just have postmodern youth. We now have postmodern childhood. And this, in a nutshell, if you don't know, is my critique of not just elite education, but education in general. That it does not encourage you, does not give you the tools, the time, the encouragement to think about the larger questions. Not even the larger questions that might help you guide your own life, like, what do I really care about? I would even venture to say that we may be moving towards a time when childhood and youth are no longer separate times of life in particular. You know, the historians tell us that once upon a time, kids were just thought of as like miniature adults. Like even if you can see this in art history, they're just like shrunken little adults. That's what we have now, shrunken little adults. Because, you know, we're all doing this now, right? We're all jumping through hoops and accumulating gold stars, whether we're in first grade or 45 years old. We have all taken upon ourselves, as if by common consent. I think this is really interesting. This just occurred to me the other day. Well, what I wanted to say is that this is not, I do not believe that this is inevitable. I think this is the result of choices that we've made, driven by an ideology that we have allowed to impose itself upon us. So what's interesting, this new sort of recognition I had is the extent to which, because, listen, I've been thinking and writing for a while about how, you know, if you major in English, people are going to say, what are you going to do with that? Or if you major in political science, they're going to say, oh, you really went for the big bucks, didn't you? But I started to think about not the receiving end of those statements, but the originating end of those statements, and that we seem to have reached this strange time, this strange situation where adults feel not only empowered, but empowered to ask these questions, but it's almost like there was a giant meeting where we were all told that we are supposed to ask, we're supposed to make those kinds of sneering comments when we meet people who are majoring in things that aren't practical. Like it's this pressure that just comes from everywhere at once. And I thought, you know, is there anything else in life where we act this way? And actually, I think there is. And it's the pressure that's directed at older young adults, and especially women, to do what? To get married and have kids. It's exactly that same kind of everyone knows the script and everyone's going to play out the script when they talk to you. So what do these two things have in common? Well, they seem together to add up to, in this society where supposedly we're all these marvelous individuals who are expressing our tremendous uniqueness through our consumer choices and each designing our own unique lives. This is the script that we're all expected to play out. And everyone is there to police you if you don't do it. This is a highly normative, normatizing situation. Study something practical, get married, have children. If you don't do that, everyone is going to shame you. Everyone is going to make you question your choices. So actually what I say to students now, students who are studying the kinds of things that's going to invite those sorts of remarks, I say, ask yourself, and even better, ask the person who's saying those things, what's at stake for them? What do you care? What do you care what I study? You know, you're like my parents' friend, or you're someone in a store. What business is it of yours? Now, probably the biggest thing I've learned from the reaction to the book, not on the part of the professional reactors, but of the people who've been speaking to me directly, is that I might have written a book about selective higher education in America, but the things that I'm describing are not just true of selective higher education, they're not just true of higher education, and they're not just true of America. These changes, the way we think about education that I'm associating with neoliberal ideology, are true everywhere and at all levels. At small colleges and large public universities, at primary and secondary schools, prep schools, public high schools, Canada, the UK, India, Singapore. So far, the book is being translated in 4 countries, 4 languages: China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. I was also recently invited to a thing in Brazil. Partly this is a matter of American higher education having become one of the most potent and desired global cultural brands, global accrediting systems. Elites in rising countries want their children to become part of the global elite by going to American universities. Just as parents in Illinois or Tennessee once wanted their kids to go to Ivy League schools when the nation was forming a global, national elite after the Civil War. That's when the Ivy League became the Ivy League. In fact, it's literally when it became the Ivy League, because it wasn't called the Ivy League. It didn't exist then. So now we have the formation of a global elite through many of the same institutions, plus a few others, Stanford, right? Or really any American college that a kid can get into. We're the new Rome, right? So the ambitious provincials are coming to the center from all over. I recently read that last year more than 136,000 kids took the SAT outside of the United States. 136,000. China and Korea alone account for 40% of our international students, and between those two countries, 150,000 students are now enrolled in American colleges and universities. The number of Chinese students grew 18% in the last year. Used to be that the numbers are around 10% on the campuses that I was familiar with. It seems like now it's more like 12%, 15%, 17%. But it's not just that everyone's trying to get to our schools. This neoliberal ideology is global, right? So even if we're talking about systems that aren't connected directly to American colleges, it's the same phenomenon, right? And it's certainly the same phenomenon here, to bring it back to our situation, right? It's reflected in the relentless focus on STEM education, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. Except nobody really wants you to study science. They don't want you to be a scientist because they don't make a lot of money. And nobody really wants you to study math. God forbid you should become a mathematician. It's basically an extinct species. So it really means technology and engineering, which are kind of the same thing anyway. So it really means technology, right? That's what we're talking about. It's reflected in the notion that the college classroom, in other words, highly skilled, dedicated instructors working with students in small groups and one-on-one can be replaced by MOOCs, online learning, computer learning, as if education were a matter of information transfer, rather than a human relationship that involves emotion and inspiration. It's reflected in our testing regimes in primary and secondary school, as if all learning could be quantified. It's reflected in the federal government's proposal to evaluate colleges based on the average earnings of their graduates, as if money were the only thing you got from college. It's reflected in what our writer-president, someone clearly very steeped in the humanities, said to a bunch of college students in Ohio last year. Do you remember what he said? He said, if you're thinking of majoring in art history, you should probably think of something else. Listen, on top of everything else, the percentage of art history majors is about a quarter of 1%. So it's this weird kind of panic, right? The biggest major there is biology there. Yes. Yeah, I mean, yes, things are maybe a little different at some colleges, but I'm not just talking about those schools. Scripps is a good place. Most schools are following the drift towards a certain, however fast or slow they're following it, and however far away they are from the norm, almost all schools are moving towards the norm. And the one that really saddens me is the University of Chicago, which used to be really one of the beacons of intellectualism, and they're just, they're doing all the things. They're doing all the things that everybody thinks they have to do. And that school's changing fast. It's reflected in the assault on the part of various Republican governors on the liberal arts. You know, what's his name, Rick Scott in Florida? His proposal was to charge different tuitions based on what your major is. Specifically, they were going to raise tuition, but not for people in STEM fields. Effectively, liberal arts majors, more tuition. And of course, it's reflected in Scott Walker's attempt. Did you catch this one? Scott Walker, our next president. I'm kidding. You know, in Wisconsin, they have this thing called the Wisconsin Idea, which is this historic relationship between the state and the state university, and they're very proud of it. And actually, the state capitol and the state university face each other along a long avenue in Madison, and they've really valued this. This is why Wisconsin, a relatively small state, has historically had one of the best public universities. It can rival California, which is many times larger and richer. So in his recent budget, and I'm quoting from a local news story, he proposed striking language about public service and improving the human condition. This is rewriting the mission of the university. Striking language about public service and improving the human condition, and deleting the phrase, basic to every purpose of the system is the search for truth. Instead, the governor made the UW system's mission to, quote, meet the state's workforce needs. He later retracted it. They claimed that it was a clerical error. I want you to tell me if I'm going on too long, okay? Because I can't see a clock here. I want to go back to those buzzwords, because I said that everyone's trying to figure out what college is about if it's not about thinking and learning, and they've come up with these buzzwords. Leadership, service, creativity. I want to expand and reflect on this by laying out a few sort of data points that may seem unconnected at first, and that I've been putting together myself. I spent a month at Claremont McKenna, one of the other Claremont colleges, a year and a half ago. It's like a college that's just like all the things that are bad in one college. 40% of their students are econ majors, or something related, you know, accounting or finance. New president, had a meeting with him at the end of my month. First thing he said to me was, he was the dean of a law school, I think at Utah. Everyone talks about the liberal arts here. We're a liberal arts college. No one's been able to explain to me what the liberal arts are. So I explained it to him. I said, no, they are those fields in which knowledge is pursued for its own sake, and therefore when you study it as an undergraduate, what you're fundamentally learning how to do is make arguments. He said, that's ridiculous. Scientists don't make arguments. Yeah, I think they do. He said, well, what about painters? I said, well, painting is not a liberal art. It's a fine art. He's like, No one's been able to explain to me what liberal arts are. So I said, well, what's the college about? He said, it's about leadership. It's in our charter. Second data point is Frank Bruni's new book. I think it's a useful book. I think it's pretty superficial, but it's useful. What's it called? Where You Go Is Not Who You're Going to Be. And it's basically an attempt to convince parents and students that it doesn't matter very much where you go to college. And most of the book consists of anecdotes of successful people who didn't go to fancy colleges, which is fine. I didn't actually go through and count, but my impression when I read the book was that most of those people were successful in business, which is fine, okay? But the point is that business involves skills that are different from the professions, right? And they involve what we might call organizational or people skills in addition to intellectual skills, which are much less important. Third observation is that kids put a lot more energy into and care a lot more about their extracurricular activities than their courses, and in particular about their internships. This has become a big, 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 big thing. And in urban schools like Columbia, it's really the internships are kind of taking everything else over. And the fourth observation is that the college classroom does or ought to do one thing particularly well, which is indeed to teach you how to make arguments, to teach you how to think analytically. This is also always the big claim for the value of the liberal arts on the job market, and it's true. They should give you a very rigorous education how to think analytically. Now, a rigorous college education requires that you be as smart as possible and think as hard as possible. So it's very well suited to train people for those professions that also require you to be as smart as possible and to think as hard as possible. Medicine, law, the sciences, academia itself, and also finance and consulting. Which is why, of those 6 fields, the 4 that actually pay good money, medicine, law, finance, and consulting, not academia or the sciences, are the professions of choice for selective college graduates. But business, including entrepreneurship, does not require you to be as smart as possible and think as hard as possible. I'm not saying that business people are stupid, okay? I think being successful requires that you be smart and that you think hard, but not very smart and not very hard. Because business and entrepreneurship also require a completely different set of skills: people skills, organizational skills, how to read people, how to judge people, how to manage people, how to manipulate people. Things that doctors, lawyers, academics, scientists, bankers, and consultants are not particularly good at, don't need to be particularly good at, people skills. And that professors and their classes are certainly not very good at teaching. So as college is increasingly understood in terms of job and career, and as job and career increasingly means business and entrepreneurialism in an age that idealizes the entrepreneur, students have gradually developed a parallel curriculum for themselves, a parallel college that revolves around extracurriculars and internships where they can learn those skills. And they are de-emphasizing courses where the skills learned, and certainly the material learned, is of less and less interest to them. Without talking about this for too long, I would say this is one of the big observations that I made this semester as a professor, and that I've corroborated with professors at other schools that I've been talking to in the last few months. You just don't get a lot of kids anymore who really care deeply about the material, who want to sit and talk about it, who have a sense of intellectual mission. Even if they're smart, even if you can engage them for the sake of the course, that's not what it's about for them. They are busy rushing from one thing to the next thing, and they want to know what they need to do to learn the material, or really to get a grade. So that's what students are doing, and I think that's what colleges are now doing themselves to try to get with the program. They are trying to retrofit a system that was designed to teach intellectual skills, and not incidentally to provide young people with the opportunity to reflect on the big questions, to retrofit it for an age that wants something very different. Which is why I think the president of a liberal arts college can end up saying that he doesn't know what the liberal arts are and obviously doesn't particularly care what they are. And And correlatively, throughout the country, colleges are trying to figure out how to teach things like leadership and creativity, which means either doing so in the classroom, which is not set up for that, through professors who don't know how to do it, or, more to the point, through creating innumerable centers and programs and ancillary activities and hiring deans and deanlets to do it. I will admit that part of my experience of the University of Chicago as it exists today was shaped by my host, who was a junior deanlet named Jimmy in a cardigan, who was very interested in talking about engagement and leadership and all the exciting things he was doing to try to help these scholars at the University of Chicago to become more attractive to what the business people, alumni, were saying they wanted out of their graduates. So, a parallel curriculum, a parallel college. And I think this is also why some people who are not invested in the academy are saying, why don't we just forget the whole thing? Why do we really need college at all? People can learn these skills on the job. They can learn the skills over the computer. This, I think, is how I understand. This is how I'm coming to terms with the word leadership, which is the biggest buzzword on college campuses today. When you go to a college campus and you hear people talk about leadership, I think the first thing that would naturally occur to you, that naturally occurred to me, is that the word has no meaning whatsoever. It is simply a word that people use because it makes them feel good. And I actually visited a class at Claremont McKenna, which talks about leadership more than any other school, and I asked them, it was a philosophy class, I asked them, what does the word leader mean to you? What does leadership mean? And at first, they had no answer, because no one had ever asked them that question. And then they started to produce answers, and the answers had to do with things like being in charge, becoming wealthy, they said this, having a lot of control over your own life. So really, it's not a meaningless term. It's a term that's become a polite synonym for success, for getting to the top. Now let's talk about service. Students today, like students always, do have moral impulses. They talk about how they want to change the world, make the world a better place, give back, make a difference. And I think those are legitimate. I mean, I'm not cynical about today's students. I'm only cynical about the way they've been educated. In fact, the only reason I'm hopeful is that I think young people provide an inexhaustible resource of curiosity and idealism. The thing is that the way they want to change the world, or make the world a better place, seems to me to be completely encased in neoliberal assumptions. I would call this Clintonism to go along with Reaganism. Clinton did one thing as president, which is to make neoliberalism, to ratify neoliberalism as a bipartisan consensus. And then what he did after he left the presidency is completely in line with that, right? The Clinton Global Initiative and all that stuff. Because basically, once the rich have all the money, we start to think about how are good things going to happen in the world? Well, the rich have to do them, right? They have to pay for them. Or let's say more broadly, the highly privileged, highly credentialed, highly resourced elites are going to do good things in the world. They are going to perform service. And this is what all those nonprofits or socially conscious for-profits that students think of starting and then often do start, this is what they're about, right? They're about using your privilege to help other people. Giving back, giving to others, this is the language of charity. Enforcing ideas of debtorship, disempowerment, hierarchy, and social relations as economic exchange. Service is us versus them, rich versus poor, white versus black and brown, the server and the served. It's a flock of upper-class messiahs descending in all their splendor with a great deal of self-satisfaction upon the miserable and helpless. Like leadership, it's a form of self-aggrandizement. You do for others, those poor, unfortunate others, what you don't think you can do for themselves. You swoop down and rescue them with your awesome wisdom and virtue. Or to put it in 3 words, teach for America. Right? This is what we're talking about. This is how neoliberalism has reshaped ideas even of philanthropy and moral action. People talk about making a better world. I would like once to ask them, just simply ask them, what is this better world that you want to make? What is this world that you envision? Because I think they would have as much trouble answering the question as the kids in that classroom had in defining the word leadership. Because I don't think anyone thinks at that level anymore, at that level of first principles. As for creativity, which sounds like a good thing, I don't think it actually gets us out of the problem. Because I think in that context, in this context, creativity is aligned with other buzzwords like innovation and disruption. In other words, creativity as it is used there is a business concept. Creativity for the sake of the consumer market. I think creativity started to become something that business desired when Apple introduced the iPod in 2001. It was the first of their devices, right? And now creativity is everywhere, but it's obviously not about becoming an artist. I know there's some artists in the room. You can ask them. No one actually wants you to become an artist. I mean, let's say no self-respecting parent who sends their kid to a fancy college wants them to become an artist. It's very small bore creativity for the sake of the market. It's inventing a new app or a new watch or a new water filtration system, but always within the existing framework. Real creativity, real imagination means getting somewhere new, not just in terms of a product or an artwork or even a life, but of a society. But getting somewhere new as a society is another possibility that neoliberalism excludes. Part of the idea of neoliberalism or postmodernity is that we are at the end of history, right? We've arrived at what an ecologist would call a climax form. You know, like the steady state that an ecosystem reaches, like the evergreen forests of the Northwest, absent some kind of cataclysmic change. It will just always be like that. So this is the idea. We've reached the end of history, which is market capitalism. Modernity was understood to be a condition of constant change. Each generation was going to bring the world forward into a new state. This is why youth was important to modernity. This is why youth was associated with revolution. We needed young people to imagine a new world. This is why the historical mission of youth is no longer desirable or even imaginable in postmodernity. The world is not going to change, so we don't need young people to imagine how. Whereas I think the biggest challenges we face, which I would say are climate change, resource depletion, and the increasing obsolescence of the human worker in the face of automated technology, are precisely problems that require not technological change, but moral and political change. But I don't think we're equipped to understand that. I've noticed, again, that most students have a sense that they want to make the world a better place. They have moral impulses, but what they don't have are ideals. They don't have a vision for a different world. I think part of the malaise of aimlessness and purposelessness that so many young people feel today comes in part from growing up at a time without ideals. What does it mean to be young in a time that has lost even the idea of ideals? The quiet desperation that we once associated with middle class, middle age has been imported backwards into adolescence. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about. We've always been a business civilization. That's Lionel Trilling's phrase. And I think we probably always will be in this country. But we've also always had counterbalancing, or as you might say, countercultural institutions I obviously don't mean that in the 60s sense, but institutions that embody a different set of values than our main institutions of our business civilization. And when the balance is tipped too far, like during the Gilded Age, something arises to set it right, like progressivism in politics, or the whole line of thought and art initiated by Emerson in the antebellum period, American Romanticism, Transcendentalism, the churches, the newspapers, and the colleges themselves. I recently read, people ask me what I think college should look like, and I point across the river. I point to Reed. And if you read the Reed Student Handbook, it will tell you that the founding statement of Reed talks about, or Joe Reed, or whatever his name was, it was an explicit rejection of what the Ivy League was during the Gilded Age, which was, you know, rich boys finishing school where they played football. It's for serious people who are going to care about scholarship. That's what he said. So, counterbalancing institution. One of the things that's happening now is that those counterbalancing institutions are themselves being swallowed by the market. The arts, where artists now have to be creative entrepreneurs, designers, serving the market. Journalism, the media. I used to write for the New Republic. Enough said, if you know what happened there. The churches, what's the big strain in evangelical Protestantism? It's the prosperity gospel. You know, Jesus is going to make you rich. And the colleges and universities themselves. If colleges and universities increasingly talk like businesses, that's because we force them to become businesses. You know, I don't want to digress too much. I don't want to take too much time. But in my book, I lay out a big historical parallel where there was an earlier ruling class that reached a moment of crisis, and part of the way they responded was by reforming elite higher education. This is the WASP aristocracy, 1929, the crash, the depression, a crisis of legitimacy. That's when, starting at Harvard and finishing at Yale 30 years later, we completely discarded the old system of prep school, sort of handshake, old boy, network, Ivy League admissions, and moved to meritocratic admissions based on SATs and grades. Because the ruling class recognized that even if they were going to save their own skins, they needed to overcome themselves and put the nation's interests ahead of their own, even if it meant the unthinkable, like letting Jews in to Yale or letting women into Princeton. And they did it. But you know, they had an ethos of service. They had an ethos of leadership that actually meant something. Right? They talked about character and self-sacrifice and duty and like the country's being placed in your hands. You need to pass it on in better shape. I'm not sure that our contemporary ruling class, the meritocracy, which I think has failed just as demonstrably as the WASP aristocracy during the Depression, if they have the moral resources to overcome themselves in the same way, because they've never been inculcated with a true sense of service and leadership. They've always been told that what they've gotten, they have earned, and that they are entitled to everything they can grab. I think another feature of neoliberalism is that it inculcates a sense of helplessness. You can't change anything larger than your own life, and ultimately not even your own life. Think about this. We're all running around trying to figure out how we're going to get out of where we are. And there's this sense that the market is just too strong. You can't argue with the market. So much of the rhetoric around college, so much of the negative response to what I wrote, suggests that young people are helpless in the face of economic forces. I'm not saying this rhetoric is coming from young people. It's on behalf of supposedly well-meaning adults who say, of course kids are afraid, of course they're risk averse. How could they not be? Well, they cannot be by not accepting the helplessness that's being imposed on them. By not accepting that they have to do what the market tells them. They have no agency and no options. There was a kid at Princeton who literally got up and said, in my talk at Princeton, he said, listen, Wall Street is paying, Wall Street is going to pay us more than anyone else. Wall Street, the market, is basically telling me that I should go work on Wall Street. Who am I to argue? I said, I'm sorry, are you telling me that the market is telling you what to do and therefore you don't have a right to decide that for yourself? And he said, yeah. So that's an extreme case, but I think that it's indicative. It's true that I've also heard about lots of people, and this is probably the best part of the response that I've gotten, lots of people doing lots of things to make things better, starting high schools on a different model, starting colleges on a different model, parenting in a different way, leading their lives in a different way. And I think that's all great. But in some ways, those solutions continue to reproduce the fundamental problem, which is that we no longer believe in public solutions. We're all trying to figure out how to get outside of the market. We're all trying to figure out how to cross the street. It just seems that world outside, it just seems to be across the street. Why can't we imagine what it looks like? Because the tools to imagine have been taken away from us. The answer is staring us in the face. The answer is the public. That's what's outside the market. Collective solutions rather than market or private sector solutions. The word leadership, which implies that problems are solved by highly trained elites, has replaced the word citizenship, which implies that problems are solved collectively by everyone. Think about how that word has disappeared from our public discourse. And yet citizenship is historically at the heart of our idea of a liberal education. Whether it was John Dewey reinventing American primary and secondary education 100 years ago, or the post-war consensus about the need for mass higher education to create an educated citizenry for a free society. This is how they talked back then. So what we really need to do is to escape from our neoliberal age and rescue education from neoliberalism, to reclaim the public as a value and as the supreme arena of social change. In brief, what I think we need to do is to raise taxes on ourselves to once again pay for free, high-quality public higher education. And if you say that that's unthinkable, I will remind you that 3 years ago it would have been unthinkable if I told you that voters in red states would approve increases to the minimum wage. Okay, what's happened since 2008, and especially since the Occupy movement in 2011, is that we've finally woken up to the inequality that neoliberalism has given us, and people are starting to push back. We're now already talking about free community college. We can do this if we muster the political will, if we want it badly enough, because we haven't reached the end of history. The world will still move forward if we push it hard enough. That's all I have to say. Come to the microphone, ask me your questions, make your statements.
Thank you for your talk.
Sure.
If America is becoming transformed from a place of soul-making, at least American higher ed, from a place of soul-making to neoliberalism, are there any 21st century countries, of the 200 other countries out there, that serve as models that we can look toward for soul-making?
No. No, but there are countries that serve as a model in another way, which is there are countries that provide free, high-quality public higher education to everyone who wants it. There are quite a few countries that do that. This is what's so ironic, right, is that we're the ones who are starting from the best position, because we're the ones with the system, this liberal idea system, this, you major in one thing and you take electives, right? Other countries created their system. Really, I think the European countries, those were still reflecting class-bound societies, their systems of higher education. We're trying as hard as we can to emulate our East Asian competitors because we think they've got it figured out. They're trying to emulate us because they wonder why we're still the most innovative, creative, dynamic economy, and they've figured out that it has something to do with the way we educate our kids. I'd like to be able to say that there is, but I'm not sure. I don't think there is. Who's next?
When we've raised taxes on ourselves to pay for free, better education, from what pool are we going to recruit the faculties and the other true leadership for that generation of students? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's a fair question. I often wonder, you know, Bill and Melinda Gates talk about everyone finishing college, and I would like to ask them where they're going to get the faculty, where they're going to get the infrastructure, whether they've thought about that. I guess everyone's going to learn from a computer. But look, I mean, as you may know, only 25% of the people who teach in college are tenure-track professors. Only 25%. About a third are what we call full-time non-tenure track, and then the rest are adjuncts. So there's actually a very large cadre of potential professors who are, I mean, I'm not, whether more people would go to college in my conception, I'm not sure. I'm simply talking about making college free for the people who are already going and who are already being taught by mainly adjuncts and other forms of casual academic labor. One of the things that I would want to pay for is not higher salaries for professors, sorry professors, but better working conditions and better salaries for most of the people who are actually doing the teaching. Look, if we end up with a shortage of professors, more people will enter the field. We have a shortage of nurses, and people are responding by entering the field. It's not going to adjust itself overnight. That's a problem I wish we had. But your question seems to imply that it's not a solvable problem. Am I wrong?
No, I didn't mean to imply that.
Okay.
But in terms of, you know, giving many examples of the mentality of the people providing the education.
Oh, I see.
And I wonder when we're going to find a new wave of educators with a new kind of.
Right. Well, here's what I would say. I mean, while I certainly have many criticisms of the American professoriate and lots of things I've seen that I don't like, I think most people, I would say the vast majority of people who teach in college, like the vast majority, I would venture to say, who teach in K through 12, hate the system they're part of, wish they could do something better, know what that better thing is, but their hands are tied. I just met with U of L faculty this morning in Eugene, and we talked about how can we incentivize professors to be teachers and mentors when all their university wants is for them to be productive scholars. So they want, I mean, professors, I think they want to teach, and the system is not helping them to do that. Does that make sense? I think the people who work in the system want things to be different, but they just don't have the power to make them different. So if somehow by waving a magic wand we made them different, I don't think we would lack for the people who know how to do it. Who's next? Don't be shy.
Just curious, in your experience at Scripps this past semester, if you met any students or professors that gave you hope.
A few. A few. I mean, listen, again, this is not to issue any kind of blanket condemnation or even any kind of condemnation. But to be honest, I mean, I had 12 students in a small writing seminar. 2 or 3 of them were truly brilliant. Most of the rest were at least really smart. I had 2 chairs in front of my desk, and 11 of the students would come in. They would sit in that chair that faced me. They would be rushing from something, often literally out of breath. They would want to talk about their paper for that week. I would try to detain them to talk about, like, them, or really to listen. And sometimes it would work a little bit, and sometimes it wouldn't, and they would rush off to the next thing. And then there was this other chair that was a little askew, because the first time the 12th student sat in it, he kind of flopped in, put his knees up on my desk, and just like wanted to talk about stuff he's been reading, which was things like Renata Adler. And I would say, you do realize no one else here has heard of Renata Adler, right? He's like, no, come on, that's crazy. He was that old school kid, and he would talk like we could have talked for 2 hours. He was that old school kid who just sat and read and was interested in ideas. The irony is that he went to Pitzer, where apparently they don't actually teach you anything. And he didn't know how to write a sentence. That may be a coincidence, but unfortunately, even he made me sad for different reasons. So, yeah.
Hi, Bill. I'm really, really glad that you're here in Portland, and I'm really thrilled that you're here. I've read a lot of your articles and your books, and so I'm delighted. I'm Karen, and I'm an academic advisor at Portland State, and we're the ones that have all those first-generation students, and our average age of our undergrads is in their mid to late 20s. And I have many of our faculty are here from PSU, and we're all in the faculty union, very active union. I wanted to just tell you that when I'm sitting and talking with our students during my academic advising sessions with them, I always ask them, how's school going? How are your classes going? What are you reading? What's exciting to you? They seem so surprised that anyone's asking them the question. And I get them talking to me about the classes they've taken. Oh, I love this history class, this sociology class, or this film class. They are definitely getting affected by the culture that says, well, what are you going to do with that? And I call them the soul-killing questions. And I talk to them about how to deal with that. We talk about it with humor. But I'm always trying to get them to think about all the things that they could be taking, what a special time of this life this is for them. And they just are really hungry to hear that. And I guess that's all I wanted to say, is they're really hungry to hear that from adults in their lives. And I think we all need to talk to our students that way more. So thank you.
Thank you. I agree, and I don't say this to bring this back to, you know, those fancy, expensive colleges, but I just want you to know that it's the same thing there. It's the same thing. And you would think it would be different among kids who are privileged. You would think that would give them freedom. Not at all. And they need to hear the same thing, and they're so relieved when they hear it. So thank you for that. Who's next?
So I heard some mention of problems with the systems, the way that they are, and people feeling powerless to change them. And other than making schools free through taxation, I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the systemic change necessary to manifest everyone's dreams into improving the education.
Yeah. Before I answer that question, I want to answer a different question. Because it is a big, powerful system with many interlocking parts. Everyone is in their own little place, being acted on by the forces that seem irresistible to them, with very little freedom of action. And I think that's a fair perception. I think the people with the most freedom of action are the students. First of all, because their job doesn't depend on it. Second of all, because they're young. So this is why my writing is directed primarily at students. And I'll say, you can't wait for the system to change, because maybe it won't, but you can change the choices you make. Now, how are we going to change the system? Even absent the question of funding, I think I would like to see, from an earlier question, universities and colleges incentivizing their faculty to be teachers and mentors in addition or instead of, or some combination of, being scholars. I think we need to do a much better job, because if you actually ask employers, they don't care what you major in, by and large, and they have, except for the fact that they have contempt for business majors. That message isn't getting back to the students and parents. So somehow we, you know, the people in the middle are the colleges, and they need to do a better job doing that. And I also think that if you're going to encourage kids not to major in obviously practical vocational things where a specific job is going to be waiting for them at the end, or a specific kind of job, it's incumbent upon the schools to help make those connections, help students find out what's out there, help them imagine different kinds of lives. And I think probably the best way to do this, and this was confirmed in some conversations I had in Eugene, is to bring in alumni so they can tell their stories and say, I was an English major at PSU, and this is what I'm doing now, and this is how I got there, and this is how being an English major helped me. So those are some ideas.
I thought it was a great talk. Any talk that pisses you off deserves great praise.
So how did it piss you off?
One of the things I wonder about is whether people have the capacity, first of all, to see what they aren't given, and second of all, whether they have the tools to realize it. You speak, for example, about the climb the number of business majors, many of the business majors are not just there because of their fond hope that it'll turn into a job, because of their self-realization that they lack the skills in writing and critical analysis, which are in fact the standard in the liberal arts. The liberal arts, notwithstanding their limits as a jumping point to wealth, are also very demanding of the investment of cultural capital, and many of the students in my world at Portland State lack it. The second thing is that echoes back to your point about the K-12 system. If you have a system that's driven by a shortage of funds, an increasing number of students per class, it churns on this whole system of multiple choice and the shortest of short answers. So when I reach students who arrive as freshmen, which is actually pretty rare because they're going to community colleges, which is my third point. But those students who often come out of the K-12 are scared because they know their limits in the tools of expression, writing, arguing, all those kinds of things. The last thing, and point on the community colleges, which I think you seized on very opportunistically, but not perhaps deeply. Maybe the community colleges are very important because the genius of American education is remediation. The audience that you're pitching to at the elite schools, by the way, I'm a professor who did not get tenure at Princeton and then moved from Princeton to Portland State. Not such a leap because I had an excellent liberal arts education at the State University of Binghamton when its first president was the president of Swarthmore, and it had about 3,500 students. But I think the community colleges are really very interesting because you've essentially earmarked a faculty whose exclusive mission is teaching. You've created a platform that operates on small class size.
Have I said bad things about community colleges?
Yeah, please take it away.
What did I say?
I'm asking you what, I mean.
I don't think I said anything about community colleges.
No, you said the business of providing free community college was a great
Yeah, it's a great
moment.
start, yeah.
Right, but I think it has more to do than being a turn on of the switch of free education. It has to do also with a different quality of learning and teaching that's realized there and kind of got lost in the four-year schools.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, 40% of college students are in community colleges.
Right.
It's the biggest, it's a huge part of the system. I'm not against them, and I'm happy to hear you say good things about them. I was a little puzzled, though, because you said that business majors major in business because they recognize they lack the kinds of skills that they would learn in a liberal arts setting. So why don't they just learn it in a liberal arts setting?
It's not that they lack the skills, it's that they don't have the courage of failure that would allow them to go into something that might be really challenging. Many of the business students would find it hard to get through a course in logic and philosophy or Shakespeare and English. I mean, really what we're talking about is, are people equipped by the 12 prior years of education to do what you did?
I mean, listen, obviously a big part of this problem is inequality in K through 12 education and bad policy in K through 12 education. That's an interesting idea. You're basically saying that the 23% of business majors in American colleges have basically created a different kind of college for themselves that's less demanding because they know they can't hack it. Well, that's interesting. But, and maybe we know there's been a big increase in the college population. Maybe that's where they're going, the people who are less well-equipped. But obviously, I mean, it's funny you say that our genius is for remediation. I mean, maybe that's true, but it's a hard statement to hear in a non-ironic way, right? Because we wouldn't need to have a genius for remediation if we did it well the first time.
Right.
And I often feel that the community colleges are really just what the high schools should be, right?
But just to jump on that, I describe myself as someone who teaches at America's first best, second chance university.
Yeah, I hear you.
So that's the point that I'm making.
Yeah.
The whole point of the community college and the point of the student coming in, as Karen pointed out, at age 21 or 3 or 4, that enormous stream of veterans and everybody else.
Right.
The other thing, too, think about how Princeton and those other places were changed by the GI Bill. I mean, I'm young enough to have had professors talk about what it was like to transform the campus as wives came. I mean, really, it's in some ways your best hope is that the system will recognize that it has obligations to people who can't make it
Right,
on the
right.
kind of blue chip education that very few of them are
Right,
getting
right.
in American high schools, whether it's the elite suburban
Right.
or the prep schools.
Right.
But the fact that, you know, there's a system to sustain them, that's really very powerful. And
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be interesting to separate out the students who criticize you because of the book's challenge of elite education and have the same questions put to those who are first generation completers on the second or third try.
Right. Okay, thank you. Who's next?
I wanted to offer a speculation about the buzzwords that you saw
Okay.
there, and because I and ask your comment on it because I think it fits your neoliberal theme, and that is that my suspicion is, and I might even put $20 on it if I could get it confirmed, is that those are institutional learning outcomes, and that this is part of the process of assessment, which has really developed strongly in the last, particularly 4 or 5 years. I'm dealing with it at my institution, which is University Pacific in California. And the challenge, I think, there is whether the faculty takes on the task of trying to operationalize those and give them some meaning, or if they don't, which sometimes often happens, the faculty says, you know, forget that, then the administration's going to do it.
So you're saying that leadership, service, integrity, and creativity are desired educational outcomes?
That's my guess.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm going to think about that, but it's still significant to me that the desired learning outcomes aren't thinking and learning. You know?
I know.
Hi.
Couple of things. Whenever we hear the word vacation these days, it seems to have been secularized.
Right.
Okay, vacation, as you know, used to refer to the idea that there was a sense in which the work chose you, right?
A
You did
calling.
Something, all right, it was a calling. And I think that concept can be revived, you know, that we need to allow our students, who I think have the capacity to think this way, to see the vocation as something that's not necessarily always coming from the market voice, okay? And that also, I think, ties in with your broader notion, which I really liked at the end of your talk, about the whole concept of a civic or building a citizen. And you know, it seems to me that that's something that neoliberalism has done. The only kind of citizen you are is your citizenship within the corporation or within the business structure. Whereas what we're talking about when we're talking about citizenship, we're talking about working within the broader community, not just shrunken down into a particular business industry.
Right.
So I really appreciated both that idea, and I think about the idea of vocation as being one that we could revive, you know, and maybe spiritualize, so that it's not commandeered simply by, so we don't just think of, oh, you know, the people who go to
Right.
vocational schools are, you know, the Fonzies of the world. Okay.
Right, that's interesting. I mean, I think, I take your point that we could reclaim that word. I think we do have a word that tries to serve that function, and the word is purpose, which I actually prefer to passion, find your passion. Find your purpose, I like that. But it seems to me that I mean, students have trouble doing that, right? That's the thing. And they'll say, I don't know what I want to do. I don't know what's calling me.
But your point earlier was that they need a period of time where they can feel confused.
Exactly,
Right now, we don't have
exactly,
that permission.
exactly. Because that's how they're going to end up hearing that call or finding that purpose.
So I work in the K-12 system. I'm a high school teacher, and I work primarily with juniors and seniors at a school that's an interesting educational model. Almost every kid goes to college at our school. And the other
Can I
thing-
ask what school it is?
It's the International School of Beaverton. It's a full international baccalaureate school, and we take all comers. It's a lottery, so every kid has to do the international baccalaureate diploma, whether they want to or not, because we don't offer anything else.
And it's a private school, a charter
No, it's
school?
public.
It's a public school.
Yeah, it's part of the Beaverton School District.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really interesting model.
Yeah.
I mean, we have kids who are there by virtue of their parents signed them up, and
Right.
In another school, they wouldn't even be counseled to take one IB class, and they take full.
How many
day of
kids do you
learning.
graduate each year?
All of them.
But how many?
So far.
How big is the
It's
school?
small, 77
Okay.
seniors this year.
Small school.
77, yeah.
It's a new school? Newish?
It's maybe 7 or 8 years old.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, I'm seeing kids, apply to college, and they really don't have the money. And I know that your dream is all college should be free. It's not gonna happen, though. And it's a great, in my lifetime, maybe down the road, I don't know. But, I'm really thinking about the kids who can't afford to ask the big questions and who can't afford to major in anything they want to major in just because it's interesting. I'm thinking about the kid who's at Whitman majoring in history, or the kid who's at Vassar and he's majoring in Japanese and history and math, and the kid who's at U of O and he's majoring. And these are all kids who got full rides. And I'm wondering about the kid who, you know, said to me, I'm going to major in nursing. And I said, that's great. You do amazing work. Why don't you just be the doctor? And she goes, I can't afford that much more college. Like, it's that many more loans. I can't do it. And I hear that over and over and over again. And even you see kids who come in and they say, oh my gosh, the college I'm interested in is giving me $30,000 a year to go to. I mean, it's so much money. And then they go, but I still can't go because I still have to come up with another $25,000 to be able to make it go per year. And it's the amount of money it costs is so crippling. Even to attend Portland State is very expensive. And the way kids manage that is because they manage to live at home. So I guess what I'm wondering is, do you know, like, is there any work out there on the students who are asking the big questions or who are majoring in majors that afford them a place of reflection and inquiry and that sort of thing? And what's the funding relationship there? Because I would assume that there's an elite group of people in our country who don't need to work and be a lawyer or a doctor or whatever because they have family money and they're paying full price. And
Yeah, this is what people always say to me. I don't buy that. I don't have the numbers. I know what the stereotype is. But first, listen, let me be clear. First of all, this is not about what you major in. You can major in nursing and you can still take classes in a general education sequence. And at U of O, they force you to do that. The system is designed to make room for both things. But this proposition that the only people who major in the impractical subjects are rich kids who don't have to work it's not true. I mean, it certainly isn't true that they're the only ones. And again, those kids often don't major in those things. Listen, I don't have numbers, so this is just anecdotal, but I meet graduates from kids get up and say, I went to X school, not a fancy school. Kid went to Skidmore, he was African-American, he was from Brooklyn, this was at the CUNY Graduate Center. He said, I went through 3 majors before I ended up with American Studies because everyone was telling me not to do it. And I did it anyway, and now I have a job that I love, helping kids like me, and the things that I learned in my American Studies major were very important for that. Or a girl at Stanford who was first generation African-American, Virginia, said, I went to a science magnet, everybody told me to study science, and I had a major life event in college, and it finally made me realize that I needed to study what I loved, which is English, and now I feel really happy. And I said, what was the major life event? And she said it was a psychiatric hospitalization. Now, granted, she was at Stanford, and maybe she was going for free. Mm-hmm. But she didn't have family resources. And she had been getting those same messages. I would never pretend that everyone is in the same position. But I also, first of all, again, it's not either or. It's really important to remember that it's not either or. But also, we have this either or mentality, like either you're rich and you can do whatever you want, or you're poor and you have to do X, Y, or Z. As if there were no middle ground and no room for negotiation and no room for individual resilience, individual courage. No, don't go to school and accumulate $100,000 in debt. If you graduate with $25,000 in debt, which is the average load, does it determine all your choices for the rest of your life? Or does it just mean that you have a certain financial pressure that's going to limit you, but isn't going to determine what you do? I just don't want to make it an all or nothing conversation, because that's what I think is really elitist and really unfair. Do you think I'm full of shit? Or naive?
We have all these kids who want to be engineers. It's unbelievable. Oregon State, Illinois, Oregon State. So, sorry, but anyway, so I'm from Indiana. What do I know? So, I tell them, great, be an engineer. That's fantastic. But at the same time, take interesting classes along the way, because one day you're going to be at a dinner party, and who are you going to be talking to at the dinner party? Another engineer or somebody else who does something else? Know something else about the world. Have ideas, ask questions about stuff. Engineering.
What do they say?
Anywhere. Some of them do it. Some of them will think I'm nuts.
I would only say I wouldn't make the dinner party argument. I mean, for one thing, I've never, and that's what they used to tell us at Columbia about why we should read Plato and Homer. I've never been to a dinner party where people talk about Plato and Homer. They talk about real estate, children, and vacations. But what I would say is, first of all, I would say it's going to make you, it's going to make you a better person, and you can help. I mean, you can talk about why it's going to help you as a. But I would also say it's going to make you a better engineer, because the engineering schools are starting to figure that out. I think the engineering employers are starting to figure that out. You can tell them that everything they learn as an engineer is going to be obsolescent in 10 years, which is true. And what they really need to learn in college is how to educate themselves. You could use a wonderful phrase that I heard. There was a symposium about the liberal arts at Lewis and Clark, intellectual cross-training. Studying different things helps you be smarter at any one of those things because you've learned different ways to think. It's so interesting that we talk about creativity and innovation over and over and over again now in our economy, and yet what we do is test, test, test for STEM fields. How do we think we're going to get creative, innovative thinkers if that's what we're doing? I don't understand it. Who's next, if anyone? It's hot in here. It's not a lot of ventilation.
Well, I work in an increasingly endangered species, which is a small private art school. And recruiting students for that is primarily based on students really wanting to be there. And very often their parents or family members being very concerned about that. And through the years, I've always addressed the family members or the parents as they're making their decisions. And I'll just say to a group of them, how many of you in the room are concerned about your student's decision to go to art school? And a lot of them will raise their hands. And I then talk about what you were talking about before, about thinking and learning, that what the students will come away with is the ability to think for themselves, and that they will learn that ability. They will, of course, we're an art school, so they will learn to make art. They will make beautiful images and objects, but the process of their learning that is something that is transferable. Now, that's not new. People have been talking about that for 20 years in making that argument, and all of the art schools make that argument. But what I'm starting to see in the audience, and I'm not sure if this is just circumstantial, in recent years, less of a light goes on in the majority of the people in the crowd, and that makes me worried. It had much more resonance even 2 or 3 years ago. So I'm concerned about that. I'm not sure if there's anything that you can add, or you know.
Do you talk about what alumni have gone on to do?
Oh yes, absolutely. And we bring alumni in to talk about that. And we have a wide range of alumni. We have students who have gone on, you know, in a predictable way, and they make visual art. They're designers, craftspeople, artists.
And they make a living, too.
And they make a living.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But then they go on into business. They get MBAs, and they're very successful in that regard. And they lead nonprofits and so on. They do a wide variety of things. And of course, we make that argument. And you know, we feel like it's compelling, and many do. But I'm concerned about this trend.
I'm sad to say that it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I don't obviously have anything to add in particular. I mean, look, I think the trends that we've been talking about have been 40 or more years in the making. But there's no question that 2008 was a shock to people. I think that just as there was kind of a bubble of optimism before 2008, I think that we've been a little traumatized by the recession and still think that we're in it. And I'm not saying things are great now, but we're not in it anymore. And we know that unemployment rates, even for young college graduates, are very low. And we know that, you know, the wage premium for college is worth even the debt that you have to take on. But I understand people are scared. But they say that fear is not a good place to make decisions from.
So for me, one of the most important things that you talked about was the need to somehow create space in our hearts and our minds to make decisions that don't buy into a neoliberal worldview. We need this little zone of protection. We need people to help us and support us and create that. And in my life, I very much experienced some of the things you talked about in your essay, going to an elite Ivy undergrad. I'm now a grad student at PSU by choice. Did not apply to any elite schools. And so for me, the key resource for where I feel like I can get that space to make decisions that do not, don't just replicate the sort of marketplace thinking is by sitting quietly by myself and using those tools I've learned, like meditation. And so I'm wondering, for you, like, is that something that comes into your thinking at all? Is that what is that? What role is our contemplative practices to have? Does that have a place in higher ed? Is that something we can or should teach, or should we think about what those practices teach us?
That's a good question. I think I'm probably going to answer it in a way that's a little broader than you intended. But you may remember from the introduction that I have this essay called Solitude and Leadership. It actually grew out of an essay on solitude. I mean, it was just about solitude. And then some people at West Point said, come and talk to our kids about solitude. And I thought, they're not going to care about solitude. What do they care about? They care about leadership. So I wrote solitude now, and all of a sudden it's this leadership essay. Like, I know the hell anything about leadership. So I think what I'm trying to say is, I don't talk about meditation. That's not a tradition I am familiar with or understand. I think I talk in a non-systematic way about solitude as it's existed and has been valued in Western culture, and especially the solitary reader. And that's my arena for solitude. I think it's the arena that a college education is best equipped to help students enter, whether having the kinds of contemplative practices you're talking about is part of, maybe not part of the curriculum, but part of what's available to students. I think that would be a great idea. I think, listen, I love that you said that, because I thought you were going to say, you know, I thought you were going to talk about community and communities of people who support you. I think that's all really important. But to me, the way to find a sense of purpose, a sense of independence and courage is precisely to shut out all of the voices, all of the messages you're getting, to recognize that you're getting them from outside, and to tune in to your inner voice. And there are different ways to do that, there are different traditions, but I think we're talking about the same ultimate thing. No, I will be here until the last person is standing.
So I found myself at the back of the room realizing that I had, was very engaged in this and wanting to say something, and realizing how firmly I was holding back from that. And then I just had a little aha that could be directly related to the fact that I did not have a liberal arts education. That although I have an advanced degree, It was, 40 years ago, largely due to family background, making that decision to pursue something that was immediately employable as opposed to something else. And that even to this day, even though most people who know me would say that I'm not particularly shy about talking, the setting in which one argues ideas and does it freely and without repercussions is an invaluable thing. And what I wanted to add and then ask about is that in my case, it was directly related to, I couldn't really afford to do that because the track that I had placed myself on, which was vocation-oriented, required an application. It required perfect grades, and it required perfect resume, and it required all kinds of things that one couldn't chance. And I remember particularly hating that I had to take English or communications as an elective because I couldn't help but engage in a real way, which resulted in an A-. And it was an enormous price to pay when you're on that track. And
Did you go to medical school?
I went to veterinary school.
Oh, that's even harder, right? To get
At the time,
to get into,
it
yeah.
was, yeah.
To get into, yeah.
So, so anyway, there just seems to
Yeah.
be some sort of a tie-in with the students who either self-track or family tracks them, or these larger forces track them, are scared of what engaging and what following a more develop the mind thing might result in. So if you can just comment on that, thank you.
It's funny, I don't make the connection between engaging and not getting as good a grade, but I certainly recognize students who don't want to take courses in things that lie outside their already existing expertise because they're afraid of what it's going to do to their GPA. And that's really screwed up. When I think of parents who are afraid of their students engaging in material, I think of my dad, who was very afraid of what college might do to me. And it did it. He didn't want me to step off the path. I think despite the uncertain job market, despite the problem of student debt, we as parents or people in the parental generation need to trust our kids a little bit more and need to remember that we were young once and we managed to find a way in the world, and that our fears for our kids are probably vastly overblown, and that kids are resilient, and if given half a chance are the best judge of what's good for them. Or to put it a different way, we need to raise kids who will become the best judge of what's good for them. Easier said than done, I know. Believe me, I know. Yes?
Actually, this is the third time I've heard you speak in the past 2 years. So I've been working on this.
You need to find something better to do.
So I am a grandparent, and I decided that I really need to start back at age 1. So I have 2 grandchildren in Portland, and I have been working with them. And I have been doing it in sort of a discussion format. So I don't read books to them. We discuss books. So a book that might normally take a parent 10 minutes to read, we'll spend a half hour, and kids naturally are asking why questions all the time. So if there's something that can be done, it is, I think, at that early age. And parents are so stressed with multiple jobs and things like that. I think most parents can't do that. So we need to find some way to be able to spend more time with kids and become really engaged with them. They love it.
Or, make it possible for kids to go to schools where they're going to get that kind of thing, right? I think when we talk about raising taxes, I think people think about themselves as parents with one part of their brain and think about themselves as taxpayers with another part of their brain. And they don't recognize that those parts can help each other. Like, it'll be easier to be a parent if we're more responsible collectively as taxpayers. Go ahead.
I kind of floundered after high school and didn't know what I wanted to do, and I spent like 7 years at the community college in Eugene. And then I thought I wanted to be an engineer, but I kind of wasn't good at math. And then I found this product design program at U of O, and I graduated from that, and I really enjoyed very much being in school. And I have like 42 grand in debt, and the only job I've been able to find so far pays about, like, it doesn't pay very much, and I'm really stressed about paying my student loan, and I really like the field that I went to school for, and I really want to do that, and it's like really not easy to find a job in that field, and I'm feeling really discouraged and confused about what I'm supposed to do now, especially with the debt, and it's really frustrating.
Thanks for telling your story. I obviously don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, I was trying to have a good plan.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I'm not gonna pretend to have a good answer to that, so I'm not going to try. I just wish you luck.
Join me in thanking Bill.
So he'll be out in the
Oh, yes.
lobby signing books
And answering more questions.
and answering more questions. Until he does.